Hello, this is Clem McDonald back with another Visual Basic.NET tutorial series video, and we're going to continue our two-dimensional array tutorial at this point. And so last tutorial we started and we looked at the differences 1D. We looked at where they might be used. We declared 2D arrays, we populated them, we used them. So let's go and do an example application at this point. So we can go ahead and I'll show you the application I've got set up here. So the application I've got set up is, again, another student mark situation. So where the scores are student 1, student 2, student 3, student 4, for instance. And then the course numbers that we have, etc. Let me run this and show you how it actually runs, and then I will show you the code behind it. So when we load up the form, we essentially have 4 list boxes here, one for each student. And then we can go ahead and say, okay, so in course number 2, student 3 got a 76. When we record that, you see course 2, student 3, 76. So we can go ahead and record different marks, etc. throughout the system. So let's just do a couple more here so that you can see. So you see the marks get put into the spots appropriately. And this is all based on a two-dimensional array. So let's close this. I'll show you a little bit of the code. So essentially what we're doing here is we're declaring our two-dimensional array here. Now the difference between what we did last tutorial and this tutorial is last tutorial we said exactly how many students and how many classes there were. In this one I'm going to show you that you can actually use constants as well. You can't use a variable in the declaration, but you can use constants. So if you create constants for the array bounds, then you can use those. And this gives you a lot more flexibility, because then throughout your entire program, rather than hard coding in the size of the array into your loops and different things, you can now use a constant. So if you need to change the number of students, number of classes, you simply just change it in the constant declaration and your entire program should still work. So let's go ahead and look at a few things. So when we load the program, we're going to initialize the mark array, which the code is right here. And so what we've done is the same sort of thing as we've done before, but using nested for loops, going from 1 to the number of students, 1 to the number of classes, and setting them to 0 in this case. We're not pre-using them with random numbers like we did last time, but in this case just setting them to 0. One of the things that you can do in a two-dimensional array is, rather than doing the nested loops, you can actually use a for each structure, and it actually will do the exact same thing. So if you use for each element as integer, and I declare it as an integer because the marks is an integer array, okay, so then we can say element equals 0 next. That actually does the exact same thing. So it's a lot shorter, a lot cleaner, and let's just run this and make sure it still works. So as you can see, the zeros are still populated in there. If not, these would actually be null or nothing values. So the fact that the zeros are actually in the list boxes tells me that that for each loop also works as well. I like that solution a lot better, and for each is something that you end up using a lot when we start talking about generic lists and generics. So the next thing we're going to do is going to display the marks. And all this is going to take the two-dimensional array and distribute its values, the element values, into the different locations within the user interface, which in this case happens to be 4 list boxes. So there's a couple ways you can do this. I wanted to show you some cleaner ways to do code when you have multiple items. When you have 2 or 3 or 4, it's not really a big deal if you do one at a time, such as this. But later on in larger programs, you'll have 50, 100, a couple hundred of the same object, and you don't want to have to do 150 lines of listbox.items.clear. So it's a lot easier if you come up with a naming schema for your items and stick to it. So in this particular one, I left the default naming schema in there from Microsoft when you first create the objects. And so listbox1, listbox2, and so you can do that. But rather than doing that, you can actually use a loop. So as you can see here, I have a for students equals 1 to num students, and then the next. If we just ignore this for a second, comment that out, you can see what we can do is you can use the me.controls collection And when you put the name of the control as the parameter for the collection, you can see here that you can actually find your control. So me.control is list box, and then the student, which is from the for loop, would find list box 1, list box 2, list box 3, and list box 4 as you go through the loop. But the control returns a collection. So in other words, it's like an array of controls. It's not a list box. So we need to cast that from a control to a list box, and we use the direct cast method to do that, and that gives us, and we convert it to a list box. And once we convert it to a list box, right after the brackets, we now have all the methods, properties, and procedures available to you for a list box. So we can do items.clear right there, and it will do one each time it goes through this loop. So in other words, when we add this one line, we can get rid of those 4 lines. Gone. Okay, I'll just comment them out so we know they're there. Then the next part is as we're going through it, so we're going to use this loop structure for 2 things. One is to clear the items in the list box. Then as each list box gets cleared, so for each student, we're going to do each class within the list box. So we're going to do list box 1, we're going to do all 6 courses. Then we're going to do list box 2, all 6 courses. List box 3, all 6 courses. So that allows us to know what structure and the order that things are happening. So we're going to go for each student, which is represented by a list box. Then we're going to do the 6 classes. So for each class, we're going to loop. So for each student, we're going to loop through the classes from 1 to the number of classes. And then what we're going to do is, again, we're going to use me.controls list box to find out the list box, cast that to a list box, and we're going to use items.add this time, and we're going to add marks student class number. So the mark in the row and column based on the student number and the class number. And that populates the boxes. And that's pretty cool. So that's all we're using here in order to declare the array, initialize the array with its default values, and then take that array and use the user interface by doing a nested loop structure such that we can display the values in those list boxes. So if we shrink those down for a second, the last thing we have is on the button. I have on the form I have a button for recording the information. So taking the current student, current course, and the mark applied. So when we go to that particular structure, we define 2 quick integer values just to get the values from the NUDs, the numeric up downs. Remember that numeric up downs dot value is a decimal, so we have to convert those to integers, and that's what option strict on requires. So once we have the student number and course number, we can set the mark for that student in that course to the mark from the other numeric up down box, again converted to an integer. Once we've done that, we are going to go ahead and display the marks. Now you can tell me that yes, we're going to wipe out all the list boxes and then repopulate them all when we only change 1 number. And yes, you're right, that's not the most efficient thing in the world, but at an introduction level that tutorials are aimed at, we're going to go ahead and do that for now. Later on, once you learn a little bit more, you get a little bit more advanced, then by all means try and be more efficient and just replace the 1 value rather than replacing them all. So again, let's run this. And within this you see, okay, so let's take student 2, course number 3, which would be gym, and student 2 got a 89 in gym. So record that. So student 2, gym, 89. And all it's doing is putting those values into the 2-dimensional array, and then we're just grabbing the values back out again in the display method. Alright, thank you very much.